So, how do you go from stiff poses to smooth, dynamic ones? How do you make sure that the pose actually looks like the character you're drawing and not, I don't know, like some random NPC? How does one maintain that fluidity? In today's video, we're going to break it down step by step. And by the end of it, I will be drawing 3 characters in 3 different poses and show you exactly how I do it. Part 1, understanding proportions and anatomy. We all know, or maybe not, and that's okay, that bodies have parts like the head, torso, arms, legs. You get the idea. But how do you figure out how big each part should be? There are these things called the size ratios. For example, how long should the arms be compared to the torso? How big should the legs be? You can find these ratios all over the internet. And speaking of proportions, let's talk about anatomy. So here's how I break it down. The head, a box to check for anatomical accuracy and applying perspective. Using a circle for the head, mainly to draw a rough version. There's also a mask method for placing facial features. I like to use a trapezium or circles to map out the torso. Sometimes I even use boxes. It all depends on what works in the moment. The goal here is to simplify the body's complex shapes into something more manageable. Finally, for the limbs, which are the hands and the legs, I use stick figures, cylinders, or even cuboids. They all work. Well, as you can see, I like mixing things up and trying different approaches because using just one method feels too restrictive. You can experiment and find your own way too. Art is all about trying new things. To make things easy for you, here's a trick. The head system. Basically, you stack heads on top of each other to measure how tall a character should be. A typical character is about 6.5 heads tall, but this changes depending on the style or body type you're aiming for. This method helps to calculate how big each body part should be in relation to the head. It's a great way to make sure the proportions look just right. But that's not all. We need to talk about just one more thing. Gesture drawing. Gesture drawing is all about capturing the movement of the body quickly. You're not focusing on the details but on the flow of the pose. It's like trying to capture the energy of the pose rather than the perfect anatomy right off the bat. When you do gesture drawing, you can use different time limits. 1 minute, 5 minutes, or even 15 minutes. And each time limit gives you a different challenge. The shorter the time, the more you focus on the essence of the pose. It's not about accuracy but about showing the overall movement of the body and analyzing where and how the important parts like the chest, pelvis, and the head are placed, which then you can practice. So here's how I do it. First, I use simple lines to capture the movement, C, S, or I-shaped lines. These lines help you understand the flow and balance of the pose. I start with the torso first and then put other parts like the head, hands, and legs. You may use the shapes we talked about earlier. After this, I slightly erase and just draw while referring to the pose. I start with the torso first and not the head because the torso is like the core of the pose. It's where all the movement connects. If you're more comfortable with drawing the head first, feel free to go ahead with that. The more you practice, the more you will get better at drawing the curves and muscles of the body. And take care to not practice too much in one go. Practice in small doses. About 15 to 20 minutes a day is perfect. That's your secret weapon for improvement over time. And don't worry if it seems a little too much. You can even start practicing using tracing. Let me show you how. Draw the line connecting the shoulder joints, the line connecting the waist, and the line connecting the pelvis. Draw the center line. Now, add shapes for the chest, pelvis, head, and limbs. You can even draw the line of action. It's the imaginary line that runs through the body and shows the overall movement. And then build the body around that line. It's a great way to learn. Now, on to the part you've been waiting for. How does all that we've talked about actually play into being able to draw any character in any pose? 3 steps, as simple as that. Step 1, collecting references. Before we start, we need to gather some references. This means pose reference, character design references, expression references, and maybe even clothing references. You can use tools like Magic Poser for help or just hop onto your favorite image search site. Since I'm going to be drawing 3 characters for this video, for each one I've gathered references for their poses, designs, and everything in between. Step 2, sketching the base. Remember the head system? Use that to check your character's proportions and sketch the pose, but using the body proportions we have just analyzed. This helps to make a body that matches the character you want and also makes use of the gesture drawing we talked about earlier. Start by drawing simple shapes for body parts, the head, torso, arms, and legs. Don't spend too much time getting it perfect. Just make sure everything's in the right place. And remember, lasso tool and transform tool are your best friends for adjustments. Step 3, adding character specific details. Now that you've got the basic body down, it's time to add the details that make them recognizable, like the hairstyle, the clothing, the accessories. This is where we make use of the character references we collected. We start by blocking in the big shapes to depict the details. It just means to make space for everything that's gonna come. Remember to not get stuck in the littlest of details early on. Follow the rule: big, medium, small. It is the order in which the shapes or details are drawn or painted. Start with the large shapes, then gradually add medium details, and finally the smallest ones. Don't get stuck on details too early. Build up from the larger shapes and you'll save yourself a lot of time and headaches. Okay, so what have we learned? Use the head system to figure out your character's proportions. Gather references for pose, design, and details. Sketch the pose using simple shapes, keeping proportions in mind. Add the character's details by starting with big shapes and moving to smaller ones. And don't forget to practice anatomy and perspective on your own. I hope this helped you feel more confident about drawing your characters in different poses. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.